All right, get ready, because today we are taking a deep dive into the fascinating world of strategy formation.
Ooh, sounds exciting.
It is. We're tackling these excerpts from Henry Mintzberg's Strategy Safari. It's amazing how a book published way back in 1998,
1998, wow.
right, can still be so relevant today.
Yeah, for sure.
So, have you ever heard of Mintzberg's elephant metaphor for strategy formation?
Oh, yeah, the one where he says that for too long, experts have only been focusing on individual parts of the strategy process, like the trunk or the legs.
Yes, like they're missing the big picture.
Exactly, like those blind men each feeling a different part of the elephant and coming up with totally different ideas about what it is.
Exactly, and that's kind of what our mission is today, to help you see that whole strategic elephant.
Love it.
We're going to unpack all 10 of Mintzberg's schools of thought on how strategies get made. And that's everything from those big Fortune 500 companies to, like, your own personal goals.
That's a pretty wide range.
It is. We obviously won't be able to cover every single detail, but we'll definitely hit those aha moments and connect them back to everyday life.
Awesome.
So let's jump right in with the design school. This one you've probably heard of.
Yeah, this is the classic one, right?
It is. It's like thinking of strategy as this deliberate process, like an architect designing a building.
Exactly. It's all about analyzing the organization's strengths and weaknesses.
Oh, yeah, the SWOT analysis.
Right, SWOT analysis, and then carefully crafting that strategy that bridges the organization's internal stuff with the external opportunities and threats.
Seems pretty logical at first, right?
Totally.
But Mintzberg, he urges us to look a little deeper here.
I like where this is going.
He's not totally sold on this, like, super neat and tidy approach.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, he argues that the design school, sometimes it can be a little too simplistic.
Too simple.
Yeah, like it kind of assumes we could fully understand and predict both the internal and external situations, which, like, who can do that?
Nobody. Things are always changing.
Exactly. Things are constantly changing. New information pops up, unexpected challenges.
Right, like trying to follow a map in a constantly changing landscape.
Yes. And that's where the problems can come in, right?
Yeah, you can end up with this rigid strategy that just can't adapt to what's really happening.
And that kind of takes us to the planning school, right?
Okay, the planning school.
Where it's even more about deliberate planning, even more detailed plans, data analysis, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, if the design school is like blueprints, the planning school is all about that construction schedule.
Yes. But, I'm sensing just a little bit of skepticism from you here.
Well, I mean, I'm all for planning. Some planning's obviously good, but I think Mintzberg has a good point about what he calls the fallacy of strategic planning.
What's that?
Well, it's like sometimes we get so caught up in the planning that we forget to actually think strategically.
Oh, so you're saying that sometimes all that planning can actually hinder good decision-making.
Totally. You get stuck in analysis paralysis, you're overanalyzing every little detail, and you're just not taking action.
You're not adapting.
Right. You can end up with this perfect plan on paper, but it has nothing to do with what's actually happening out there.
Yeah, I've seen that happen.
Oh, it happens all the time.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the positioning school. Now, this one,
Okay.
it's all about finding that optimal position in the market.
Yeah, like a strategic sweet spot, right?
Exactly. And that's where Michael Porter's 5 forces comes in.
Right. Analyzing all those competitive forces.
Yes, exactly.
Like the new companies entering the market, how much power the suppliers have, the threat of substitutes, and then that competition among everyone who's already out there.
It's almost like a game of chess.
It is. You got to anticipate those moves. You got to find that spot where you can maximize profit, and you got to minimize how vulnerable you are.
A balancing act.
It totally is. But Mintzberg, he had some thoughts on this one, too.
Of course you did.
Well, he agrees that industry analysis is important, but he argues that if you only rely on these generic positions, like just cost leadership, just differentiation, or just focusing on a niche.
You get stuck in a box.
Yeah, he calls it strategic myopia.
Meaning you're so focused on fitting into that box that you might miss out on something really cool and unique.
Exactly. Like saying, we're the low-cost company, and then never even thinking about how you could do something different or add something new to your product or service.
Or the opposite, getting so caught up in being different that you forget about, like, basic stuff.
Yes, like managing costs.
It's tricky, right?
It is. You got to understand the whole playing field, but you can't let it limit you.
Okay, well, speaking of breaking free from those boxes, let's talk about the entrepreneurial school.
Ooh, this is where things get exciting.
This is the school of, like, visionaries, disruptors, rule breakers.
Totally. Think Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, that kind of energy.
Yes. It's about having that gut feeling, trusting your instincts and
Yeah.
having that, like, drive to just go for it.
Yeah, even if everyone else thinks you're crazy.
Exactly.
But of course, there's always a flip side. What happens when that leader isn't there anymore? Or what if their vision, what if it's wrong?
Those are great points. It really highlights that fine line between, like, brilliant leadership and too much reliance on one person, doesn't it?
It does. You've got to build something that's bigger than any one person, something that can keep going even if the founder isn't there anymore.
Right. It's like building a company around a set of shared values instead of just one personality.
Exactly. Okay, ready for something completely different?
Hit me.
Let's dive into the cognitive school. Now this one,
Ooh, what is this?
it takes us inside the mind of the strategist.
So we're talking psychology now.
You got it. This is all about how our own mental models, our biases, the way we see the world, how it all affects the way we approach strategy.
So it's like understanding how our brains work so we can be better at making strategic decisions.
Exactly. It's like trying to understand the operating system of a computer?
Yeah, I like that. But, it seems like this is all pretty theoretical, right? Like, has this school actually given us any practical tools we can use?
That's a great point. It is still pretty new and there aren't a ton of concrete tools yet, but
But there's potential.
there's a lot of potential. I mean, so much of what we do is influenced by our unconscious biases, right? So if we can bring those out into the open and understand them, I think that's huge.
Yeah, that self-awareness is so key.
Totally.
Wow, this has been an incredible start to our strategy safari.
I know, right? We've already covered so much ground.
We have, and we're just getting started. We got 5 more schools of thought to go.
I can't wait.
So stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll continue our exploration.
It's going to be good.
See you next time. Welcome back to our Strategy Safari. We are still hanging out with Henry Mintzberg's Strategy Safari and checking out all the ways to think about how those strategies actually form.
It's like we've opened up this whole toolbox full of lenses.
Oh, I like that. Lenses.
Yeah. Different lenses for viewing this whole strategic landscape.
I like that a lot. So in the first part of this deep dive, we went through 5 of those lenses: the design school, the planning school, the positioning school, the entrepreneurial school, and the cognitive school.
So many schools.
I know, right? But they all look at different parts of the strategic process.
Right. From like that really deliberate planning to how intuition plays a part
Mm-hmm.
and even how like our own mental models can shape how we view things.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But how do all those different approaches actually work in the real world? I mean, do companies actually fit neatly into just one of these schools? Or is it a little more complicated?
Oh, it's definitely more complicated.
Yeah.
That's one of the things Mintzberg really gets into in this book.
Okay.
He says it's rarely that black and white.
So it's not about just picking one school and sticking to it no matter what.
Yeah, it's more like a spectrum
Okay.
with different companies falling at different points on that spectrum.
Right. Depending on their circumstances.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance between deliberate planning and that emergent strategy.
You've mentioned that tension between planning and emergence a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Sure. So deliberate strategy is what most people think of when they hear strategy. It's like setting those clear goals. You make those detailed plans and then you execute them super precisely.
Like a military operation.
Exactly. But emergent strategy is a lot more organic. It kind of grows more naturally.
Okay.
It's about spotting those patterns that kind of emerge over time.
As a company kind of figures things out.
Right. As they try things out, get new information.
Oh, those they go.
Exactly.
So you're not saying we should throw planning out the window completely, but we got to be ready to adapt, right?
Totally. Think of it like a jazz musician.
Okay.
They have a melody in mind. They have a basic structure to work within, but
riffing.
yeah. They're listening to the other musicians. They're feeding off the energy of the crowd.
That's a really good analogy.
So they have intention, but they're also ready to improvise.
So that balance between intention and improvisation, that's what's important in strategic decision-making.
It's key. So the question is, how do companies actually find that balance? Like, how do they know when to follow the plan and when to just kind of go with the flow?
Yeah, when to trust their gut.
That's where Mintzberg's different types of strategies come in.
Okay.
He lays out this whole spectrum from like super deliberate to purely emergent.
Walk me through it.
Okay, so at one end, you've got the plan strategy. This is all about meticulous planning, tons of detail.
Those detailed blueprints we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You got to have tight control over execution.
I can see how that would be good in some situations.
It works best when things are stable, when the future is fairly predictable.
Okay, like if you're building a bridge or something.
Yes. Or manufacturing a product where everything has to be exactly the same.
So what happens as we move away from those purely planned strategies?
Then we start to see those blended strategies.
Blended. Right.
Like the entrepreneurial strategy that's usually driven by these visionary leaders, you know? They have a strong sense of where they want to go.
But they're open to new ideas.
Right. They're willing to change course if they need to.
Okay, so like when Steve Jobs shifted Apple's focus to the iPod and iTunes, even though it wasn't originally part of the plan.
Exactly. A classic example of that entrepreneurial strategy.
Interesting.
Then you've got umbrella strategies. That's where leaders set some broad guidelines,
Okay.
but then they let people within the organization experiment.
So it's kind of like giving them a compass and a general direction, but letting them figure out the actual route.
Exactly. Think of Google.
Right.
They encourage their employees to work on their own projects, you know, and that leads to some amazing innovations.
Right. So you get that top-down guidance, but you're also encouraging that bottom-up creativity.
It's a great way to foster adaptability.
So it sounds like as we move along this spectrum, we're getting more and more emergent.
You got it. Next up is the learning strategy. This one's all about trial and error, experimentation, collective learning.
So it's less about having that perfect plan up front and more about adapting to changes along the way.
Exactly. Think about how Honda entered the American motorcycle market.
Okay.
They didn't have this big, grand strategy, but they were really good at learning from their mistakes, and they just kept adapting and improving.
And they ended up dominating the market.
They did. And finally, at the far end of the spectrum, we have imposed strategies. This is where those external forces really come into play,
External forces like what?
like government regulations, you know, or big economic shifts.
Or technology changing everything?
Exactly. It's not so much about making a strategic choice as it is about responding to a situation that's out of your control.
Okay, so like those energy companies that are having to adapt to the rise of renewable energy.
Exactly. Or those traditional retailers figuring out how to compete with online shopping.
That's a great example.
So you see how this spectrum gives us a way to map out the strategic landscape?
It does. It shows us all the different ways companies can approach strategy.
And it shows us that there's no magic formula.
Right. No one size fits all.
The key is understanding the context, the industry, the competition,
All those factors.
and then finding the balance that works for you.
So how do leaders actually navigate all of this complexity? How do they make sense of all these different approaches and then actually use them effectively?
Well, that's where Mintzberg's leadership roles come in.
Leadership roles? Like what?
He talks about these archetypal roles that leaders can take on in the strategy process.
Okay, archetypes.
Yeah, like different leadership styles, each with their own strengths and weaknesses.
We already talked about the visionary leader.
We did. That's a big part of the entrepreneurial school. But there are others.
Like what?
You've got the architect. This is the leader who loves data, loves analysis, loves making those comprehensive plans.
They're all about that plan strategy, right?
Yes, they're the ones who create those detailed blueprints. But we've talked about how planning alone isn't enough.
Right. Got to have that flexibility.
Exactly. So that's where the learner comes in.
Okay.
This leader embraces experimentation. They're all about continuous learning. They're good at adapting.
It's like having a growth mindset.
Totally.
They're open to feedback. They realize that sometimes the best way forward is to just try things out.
And then you've got the visionary, who we already talked about.
Right.
They're the ones who can really paint a picture of the future.
Yeah, like Martin Luther King Jr. or Nelson Mandela. They had a vision that inspired whole movements.
Exactly. But a vision without action isn't enough, right?
I get things done.
So then you need the mobilizer. This is the leader who can make that vision a reality.
Okay, they take that big idea and break it down into smaller steps.
They build coalitions, they get people excited, they make sure things actually happen.
They're the ones who get everyone moving in the same direction.
Exactly. And then you've got the navigator. This leader is all about guiding the organization through those rough waters.
Okay, so they're anticipating challenges, making those tough calls.
They're keeping the ship on course, even when there are storms.
They're the steady hand at the helm.
Exactly. And last but not least, you've got the nurturer.
The nurturer.
This leader is all about building a strong culture.
So that's about creating a workplace where people feel supported, valued.
They feel empowered to contribute.
Like a gardener.
Yes, a gardener creating the right conditions for things to grow and thrive.
I love that analogy. So all of these leadership archetypes, they show us the different skills and perspectives that leaders bring to the table.
They do. And it's not about picking just one
Right.
good leaders, they blend these different roles.
Depending on what's needed at the time.
Exactly. It's about having a versatile leadership toolkit.
This has been another incredible part of our strategy safari. We've talked about deliberate versus emergent strategy, that spectrum of strategic types, and all these different leadership roles.
We've covered a lot of ground, but believe it or not, there's still more to explore.
I can't wait to see what else Mintzberg has up his sleeve.
We'll dive even deeper into the big questions behind strategic thinking, and we'll talk about how you can use these ideas in your own life.
Stay tuned for the final part of this deep dive.
That's going to be epic.
Welcome back to our final deep dive into Henry Mintzberg's strategy safari. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. We've covered so much ground from those 10 schools of thought.
Right, to that whole idea of planning versus emergence.
And even those different leadership styles.
It's like we've been on this amazing safari, exploring all these different landscapes of strategy.
I love that analogy. And, you know, like any good safari, the real learning comes from reflecting on what we've seen.
Connecting it back to our own experiences.
Exactly. So let's take a step back and look at the big picture. What are some of the key takeaways from this book that really stand out for you?
Well, for me, one of the most powerful insights is that there's no one right way to do strategy.
Right. It's not about finding that one magic formula.
Yeah. Mintzberg shows us that each of those 10 schools of thought offers a valuable perspective.
But none of them has all the answers.
Exactly. It's like we've been putting together a puzzle, and now we're starting to see how all the pieces fit together.
I like that. Mintzberg gives us this framework for understanding how complex strategy really is.
Yeah, it helps us make sense of all the different forces at play.
And ultimately make better decisions.
He also pushes us to think critically about some of those assumptions we often make about strategy, doesn't he?
He does. Like the idea that we can control everything.
Right. Like
Yeah.
we can just come up with this perfect plan and everything will go exactly as we envisioned it.
That's just not realistic.
No, it's not. He reminds us that the world is unpredictable. It's constantly changing.
Which brings us back to that idea of deliberate versus emergent strategy.
We might have a plan, but we got to be ready to adapt.
To seize those unexpected
And
opportunities.
sometimes even to just completely change course.
You got to be flexible.
Exactly. And that kind of adaptability, it requires a different kind of leadership,
Right. One that's okay with not knowing everything.
with being comfortable with ambiguity.
And with constantly learning and evolving.
So it's not just about the strategy itself, it's also about the mindset and the skills you need to navigate that ever-changing landscape.
Absolutely. Another assumption Mintzberg challenges is that whole obsession with finding a unique strategy, something that's never been done before.
Yeah, like you have to be totally different from everyone else.
He gets why differentiation is appealing, but he warns against getting so caught up in being different that you lose sight of what actually matters.
So it's not about being different just for the sake of being different.
It's about finding an approach that's authentic to your organization.
Something that aligns with your values and helps you achieve your goals.
Well said. And finally, Mintzberg gets us thinking about the pace of change.
Okay, pace of change.
Some organizations, they thrive on constant disruption.
Like they're always shaking things up.
But others, they prefer a more gradual approach.
A slower, more steady pace.
And you know what? Both can be successful.
It just depends.
It depends on the context, the industry, all those factors we've talked about.
So the key is to understand your own internal and external dynamics.
And then choose a pace of change that makes sense for you,
All of this leads to what Mintzberg calls strategic thinking.
which goes beyond just analyzing data and making plans,
It's about seeing those bigger patterns
connecting the dots.
and making good judgments, even when things are uncertain,
It's about being able to hold multiple perspectives at the same time
to challenge your own assumptions.
and to make decisions based on both your gut feeling and careful analysis.
And those skills, they're not just for CEOs and executives,
No, they're valuable for everyone, whether you're leading a team, starting a business.
or just trying to figure out your own career path.
Those strategic thinking skills are essential.
So as we wrap up this amazing deep dive into strategy safari, what's one final piece of advice you would give to our listeners as they continue their own strategic journeys?
I would say embrace the messiness.
Now, messiness.
Don't get too attached to any one way of thinking.
Be open to new ideas.
Experiment. Learn from your mistakes and never stop asking questions.
I love that. It's about being a lifelong learner.
Always adapting, always evolving.
This has been an incredible exploration.
It really has.
I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how strategies are formed and how important strategic thinking is, not just in business, but in life.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, this is just the beginning.
There's so much more to learn.
Keep exploring, keep experimenting, and keep looking at that strategic elephant from every angle.
Well said. Until next time, happy strategizing.